In 1989, the world stood divided by fear, walls, and weapons. Then, without warning, a quiet whistle drifted across the airwaves. No anger, no rebellion, just hope. When Scorpions released Wind of Change, they didn't know they were capturing the sound of history itself. Because sometimes, the biggest changes don't arrive with explosions, they arrive like a breeze. Some rock songs define a band, some define a generation, and then there are the rare ones that define a moment in human history. Wind of Change is one of them. When Scorpions released the song in 1990, they didn't just write a ballad, they captured the sound of a world holding its breath, standing at the edge of something new, fragile, and uncertain. This wasn't rebellion, this wasn't anger, this was hope, a world divided by fear. To understand why Wind of Change mattered, you have to remember the world it was born into. For decades, the Cold War had split the planet into two opposing sides: East versus West, freedom versus control. Suspicion ruled everything. Borders weren't just lines on maps, they were walls, weapons, and watchtowers. People grew up believing the division would last forever. Music crossed borders, but politics did not. And then, something shifted, the night that planted the seed. In 1989, Scorpions performed at the Moscow Music Peace Festival. It was one of the first times major Western rock bands were allowed to play openly in the Soviet Union. What the band witnessed changed them forever. Thousands of young Russians sang along, not in anger, not in protest, but in unity. They knew the words, they knew the melodies, they knew the spirit of rock music, even though it had been restricted for years. For lead singer Klaus Meine, the moment felt unreal. Enemies on paper, brothers in reality. That night, walking along the Moskva River, a melody began forming in his head. Simple, whistled, almost childlike. It felt peaceful, a rock song that didn't sound like rock. Wind of Change didn't follow the usual rules. There was no explosive riff, no aggressive chorus, no rebellious sneer. Instead, it opened quietly, with a whistle. That alone made it risky. Rock radio wasn't known for subtlety, and yet that whistle became one of the most recognizable openings in music history. Why? Because it disarmed people. It didn't shout at the world, it listened to it. Lyrics that spoke to millions. The lyrics of Wind of Change are intentionally simple. No political slogans, no speeches, no accusations, just images. Walking down the street, memories drifting like the wind, a future waiting to be shaped. This simplicity allowed the song to mean something personal to everyone who heard it. To people in Eastern Europe, it sounded like freedom approaching quietly, carefully. To people in the West, it felt like relief. To everyone else, it felt like possibility. This wasn't propaganda, it was emotional truth. When the Berlin Wall fell and the song found its moment. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Concrete that once symbolized division was suddenly being torn apart by ordinary people. Families reunited, strangers hugged. History moved faster than anyone expected. When Wind of Change reached global audiences shortly after, it felt prophetic, like the song had been waiting for this moment all along. It didn't cause change, but it gave it a soundtrack.
Why the song felt different from protest anthems? Rock history is filled with protest songs, angry, loud, defiant. Wind of Change chose another path. It didn't fight the old world, it welcomed the new one. That's why it reached audiences far beyond rock fans. It played on radio stations that normally avoided heavy guitars. It crossed age groups, it crossed borders. Even people who didn't care about rock music felt its message. Change didn't have to arrive with violence, it could arrive like a breeze. Skepticism, backlash, and the courage to stay soft. Not everyone loved the song. Some critics dismissed it as too sentimental, too gentle, too optimistic. But Scorpions stood by it. They understood something many artists forget. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes strength is choosing hope when cynicism feels easier. In a world trained to expect conflict, Wind of Change dared to imagine peace. How time has strengthened the song. More than 30 years later, the song hasn't faded. In fact, it has gained new meaning. The Cold War may be over, but division still exists. Borders still harden. Fear still returns in cycles. And every time the world feels like it's drifting backward, Wind of Change resurfaces, not as nostalgia alone, but as reminder that change is possible, that walls can fall, that history isn't fixed. Why younger generations still connect? For listeners who weren't alive in 1989, the song carries a different power. It represents a moment when humanity chose cooperation over confrontation, even briefly. In an age of constant conflict and online outrage, that idea feels almost radical. The song doesn't demand belief, it invites reflection, and that invitation still works. The legacy Scorpions never expected. Scorpions were already successful before Wind of Change. Big tours, big albums, big crowds. But this song gave them something rare, historical relevance. They weren't just witnesses to change. They became part of how the world remembers it. Few bands can claim that. Even fewer do it with a whistle and a whisper instead of a scream. Why it still feels like the best rock song of all time? Calling Wind of Change the best rock song of all time isn't about technical brilliance or musical complexity. It's about impact. This song crossed political borders, united opposing cultures, captured a turning point in history, and still speaks decades later. That's more than music. That's legacy. A song that belongs to the world now. Today, Wind of Change no longer belongs only to Scorpions. It belongs to people who lived through the Cold War, people who watched the Berlin Wall fall, people who still believe the future can be better. It plays at memorials, at documentaries, at moments of reflection, because it reminds us of something easy to forget. Change doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly and changes everything. Final reflection. Rock music is often remembered for rebellion, for volume, for rage. But once in a generation, a song appears that proves rock can also be gentle and still shake the world. Wind of Change didn't tear walls down with force. It reminded people why they wanted them gone. And that may be the most powerful thing music can do.